The day Matthew Hawkins drove the last fence post into the ground on the western boundary of his property, he stood there with sweat dripping from his jaw and realized he had no one to call over to look at what he had done. That was the spring of 1884, and the ranch sat at the edge of the Colorado high plains like something that had grown up from the soil itself, patient and deliberate, framed by a ridge of cottonwoods to the north and a slow creek to the east that hummed all summer long. He had been building it since he was 22 years old, a green and stubborn young man who had come west from Tennessee with $40, a mule named Garrison, and a deed to 160 acres that his uncle had won in a poker game and lost interest in before the ink was dry. Matthew had not lost interest, not once in 15 years. He built the main house first, which took him 2 winters working mostly alone with occasional help from a Cheyenne man, named 2 horses who lived 3 miles north and sometimes traded labor for grain. The house was not grand by any measure that would impress a traveler passing through, but it was solid in a way that mattered out here, where the wind came down from the mountains in January with a personal kind of fury. The walls were thick adobe and timber, the fireplace wide enough to heat the whole front room, and the windows faced south and east so the morning light came in gold and warm. There were 2 bedrooms upstairs and 1 downstairs, and Matthew had never once slept in any room but the downstairs one, leaving the others empty in a way that he never quite examined too closely. Over the following years, he added a barn with proper stalls for 6 horses and room enough in the loft for 2 seasons of hay. He put in a root cellar and a smokehouse. He dug a well that hit clean water at 30 feet, which he considered one of the better pieces of luck he had ever received from this hard and indifferent land. He planted an apple orchard of 12 trees along the south wall of the house, and every fall when they bore fruit, he had more apples than he knew what to do with. So he made cider and gave the rest to the Cheyenne families who camped along the creek in October. 2 horses told him once that Matthew was the strangest white man he had ever seen, not because he gave things away, but because he seemed to be preparing for something he did not yet know the name of. Matthew did not disagree. He could never fully explain why he built rooms that stayed empty or why he planted twice the garden he could eat or why, when he finally hired 2 hands in 1881, he built them a proper bunkhouse with glass windows instead of just a lean-to against the barn. He told himself he was building for a profitable operation, which was also true. By 1884, the Hawkins Ranch ran 240 head of longhorn cattle, had a reputation for producing sound quarter horses that cowboys from 3 counties came to buy, and turned enough profit each year to pay his 2 hands, a laconic Texan named Cole Briggs, and a young Mexican man named Ernesto Salinas, a fair wage with a little left over for improvements. But the truth that lived in the quiet center of Matthew Hawkins was simpler and more uncomfortable than profit. He was building for someone. He had always been building for someone. He just did not know who. He was 37 years old now, which in the hard arithmetic of frontier life felt somewhat late to be waiting for a person whose name you did not know. He was not a man given to complaint, and he rarely said anything about the solitude that draped over the ranch once Cole and Ernesto turned in for the night and the fire burned down to coals. He sat on the porch in the evenings and listened to the creek and told himself it was enough. Most evenings he believed himself. It was a Tuesday in early September when the wagon came up the road. Matthew was at the corral working with a 3-year-old sorrel mare who had recently decided she did not care for the feel of a saddle and was expressing this opinion in athletic and creative ways. He had her on a long line and was asking her to move through her paces, watching the way she carried herself, reading the tension in her shoulders, when Ernesto came out of the barn and said, "There is a wagon on the road, Mr. Hawkins." Matthew glanced up. The road that connected his ranch to the town of Caldwell, 7 miles southeast, was visible from the corral as a pale scar through the grass, and on it He could see a single horse pulling a flatbed wagon at the slow pace of an animal that had been pushed for some miles and was making no secret of its exhaustion. There was a figure on the wagon seat, slight against the wide sky, and even from this distance Matthew could see the posture of someone who had been traveling a long time and was running out of the particular brand of stubbornness that kept a person upright. He handed the line to Ernesto. "Keep her moving easy. Do not let her stop while she is still wound up." He walked to the gate and leaned on the top rail, watching the wagon come. The horse was a bay with a white blaze, unremarkable and clearly spent. The wagon was loaded with trunks and crates lashed down with rope, more than one person typically traveled with, but the figure on the seat appeared to be alone. As the wagon drew close enough, he could make out that it was a woman. She wore a dark blue traveling dress that had once been fine and was now comprehensively dusty, and her hair, which appeared to be a rich dark auburn, had come partly loose from its arrangement and was moving in the September wind. She had one hand on the reins and one pressed against the side of her face, in the manner of someone managing a headache or possibly a great deal of emotion, and she was staring at the road ahead with an expression of absolute determination that Matthew recognized immediately as the look of a person who has come too far to stop now regardless of what comes next. She pulled the bay to a halt at the gate of his property and looked at him over the fence. Her eyes were a clear and startling gray-green, the color of creek water in August. She had a fine-boned face with a quality of intelligence in it that was immediately apparent, and she was perhaps 30 years of age, though the road had a way of adding years to a face that sleep and a proper meal could subtract again. "Is this the Hawkins ranch?" she asked. Her voice was steady despite everything, low and clear, with the faint trailing vowels of someone who had grown up in the South. "It is," Matthew said. She closed her eyes briefly and exhaled as though something wound very tight inside her had been released. "Good," she said. "I am Rose Leland. I have been looking for this road for 4 hours and my horse has approximately 4 miles left in him." Matthew opened the gate. "Bring him through." She guided the bay into the yard with practiced ease, which told him she was not helpless with a horse even if she was not a ranch woman. When she pulled up near the water trough, Matthew took the bay's bridle while she set the brake and climbed down from the wagon seat with the careful movements of someone whose entire body had forgotten what it felt like to stand upright. She gripped the wagon side for a moment, then straightened and smoothed her skirt with a dignity that was so automatic it was clearly just who she was. "Thank you," she said to Matthew, looking at him directly. Most people he had noticed over the years had difficulty with direct eye contact. Rose Leland did not appear to suffer from this problem. "You are welcome," he said. "How can I help you, Miss Leland?" "Mrs.," she said, and something moved through her expression quickly, a flash of something that was not grief exactly but lived in the same territory. "Though the Mrs. has been absent for 2 years now, he passed. Fever." "I am sorry," Matthew said, and meant it. "I am going to need to ask you a fairly significant favor," she said, "and I would like to apologize in advance for arriving at your property unannounced and asking for it, because I know that is not the way things are done, and I have never in my life arrived unannounced at a stranger's property before today." She paused. "My circumstances have been somewhat unusual recently." "Tell me about them," Matthew said. She looked at him for a moment as though measuring whether this was a man she could trust with a straight account of things. Whatever she saw must have satisfied her, because she nodded once and began to talk. Her name was Rose Leland, and she had come from St. Louis, Missouri, where she had lived for the past 7 years with her late husband Thomas Leland, who had been a reasonably successful dry goods merchant. When Thomas died of typhoid fever in the summer of 1882, he had left behind a modest estate that was supposed to provide for Rose comfortably. What he had not disclosed to Rose, due to what she could only describe with careful restraint as a dramatic failure of communication, was that a significant portion of that estate had been used as collateral against a business loan, taken out with a man named Gerald Purvis, a lender of the aggressive variety who had shown up at Rose's door approximately 11 days after Thomas's funeral with papers that were, according to 3 separate lawyers Rose had consulted, entirely legitimate and entirely catastrophic for her financial situation. She had spent the next 18 months in St. Louis attempting to recover something from the wreckage while the money dwindled and the lawyers consumed what was left. In the spring of 1884, with what remained of her own personal funds, which were the proceeds from a small inheritance her own mother had left her, and which Gerald Purvis had no claim to, she had made a decision that her St. Louis friends considered either very brave or completely deranged, depending on their temperament. She had come west. "My mother's brother," she said, "was a man named Harold Leland. He homesteaded 160 acres 12 miles northwest of Caldwell in 1869 and worked it for 10 years before he died without a wife or children and left the land to my mother, who never came out to see it and eventually passed herself and left it to me. I have never seen it either. I have been paying the county taxes on it for 2 years because my husband handled it before that, and I felt I owed it to Uncle Harold not to lose it." She stopped, seeming to gather herself. "I have come to see if it can be made into something. I have enough money to sustain myself for 1 winter if I am very careful. What I do not have is any practical knowledge of how to do what I intend to do, or any shelter on the property, which I understand may have reverted to foundation and weeds." She looked at him with those direct gray-green eyes. "I was told in Caldwell that you are the most established rancher in this part of the county, and that you are a fair man. I am asking if you would be willing to help me figure out what I have and what it is possible to do with it." Matthew looked at her for a long moment. The September sun was getting lower, turning the grass to amber, and behind Rose the mountains made their perpetual wall against the sky. She stood there with her dusty traveling dress and her half-unwound hair and her exhausted bay horse and looked back at him without flinching, and Matthew Hawkins felt something happen in his chest that he had no adequate name for, something like the feeling when you have been walking in a direction for a very long time, and you round a corner and there is exactly what you were walking toward. He said, "I know the Leland property. Your Uncle Harold was a good man. He sold me grain 3 years running before he died." He paused. "The cabin is still standing. It needs work, but it is standing." Rose visibly relaxed. "That is the best news I have received in some months." "You are not going out there tonight," Matthew said, not as a command but as a plain statement of conditions. "It is 3 hours to dark and the road gets rough past the Second Creek crossing. You will stay here tonight. Mrs. Briggs will—" He stopped because there was no Mrs. Briggs. Cole was unmarried. He reorganized. "Ernesto's wife Carmen is here most days and she will help you get settled. You can use the upstairs room." Something in his tone must have communicated the absolute absence of anything except practical hospitality, because Rose did not look uncertain or offended. She looked grateful in the manner of someone who has been holding a great deal of weight and has been offered a place to set it down briefly. "That is very kind, Mr. Hawkins," she said. "Matthew," he said, and then was faintly surprised at himself for saying it. She looked at him with a small, quiet curve of her mouth that was not quite a smile but was close enough. "Matthew, then," she said. "Rose." Carmen Salinas, who was 24 and the most competent person on the ranch in Matthew's private assessment, arrived within the hour with a basket of food and a complete lack of fuss that Rose appeared to find deeply comforting. Carmen had grown up in New Mexico and had her own thoughts about women making their way alone in difficult country, which she expressed through the practical language of hot food and a freshly aired bedroom and a jug of warm water for washing, all of which she produced with a calm efficiency that asked no questions and made no judgments. Matthew ate supper at his own table that evening across from Rose Leland, which was the first time in 15 years he had eaten supper at that table with another person, and did not quite know what to do with the feeling it produced. They talked about the Leland property, which Matthew knew reasonably well because two of his fence lines were adjacent to its eastern border. He told her what the cabin needed, which was mostly a new roof and some work on the chimney and the floor, and what the land was like, which was good grass country with decent water access from a branch of the same creek that ran through his own property. He did not tell her what he was thinking, which was that a woman alone on 160 acres in this country was facing a harder proposition than she perhaps understood, not because of any deficiency in herself, but simply because of the mathematics of frontier ranching. The work was immense and continuous and unforgiving of small errors, and required either a crew or a very specific kind of partnership. But he also did not underestimate her. He had been paying attention since she drove through his gate, and what he had observed was a woman of considerable intelligence who had shown up where she said she would, asked for help plainly without apology for her situation or excessive drama about it, and shown more composure after a long, hard road than most men he had hired on over the years. He held his opinion and served more coffee. Rose slept in the upstairs room that had been empty for 11 years, and woke to the sound of cattle moving across the lower pasture and the smell of wood smoke from Carmen's kitchen fire. And for a moment in the early morning light before she was fully awake, she forgot all of it, Thomas's death and Gerald Purvis in St. Louis, and the 2 years of legal grinding, and just lay in the clean air of a September morning in Colorado, and felt something she had not felt in a very long time, which was that she might be going to be all right. She came downstairs to find Matthew already at the table with coffee, a map spread out before him. He was a tall man with dark hair going gray at the temples, and the kind of face that sun and wind have worked on for years, all clean lines and weathered angles, with brown eyes that were direct and attentive in a way she had not encountered often. He looked up when she came in and said good morning without either the self-consciousness of a man who has spent the night worrying about the propriety of her presence or the false hardiness of one who is performing ease he does not feel. He simply looked at her like a person he had been speaking with the previous evening and was continuing to speak with now, which she found unexpectedly steadying. "I have drawn out the Leland property as best I can remember it," he said, moving the map so she could see. "Your northern boundary runs along the second ridge. Good grass up there, but rocky for anything you would want to plow. The creek branches here," he pointed, "and it runs year-round. Your best pasture land is the central 40 acres. The cabin sits here, on a rise just east of the creek." Rose leaned over the map and studied it. She had brought paper documents from St. Louis, the original deed and several county records, and she set these beside Matthew's drawing and began comparing them. Her attention to detail was methodical, he noticed, and she asked sharp questions. What was the condition of the creek crossing? Whether the fence line on the eastern border was current? Whether the ridge pasture had been grazed in the past several years or had recovered? Cole Briggs appeared in the doorway during this discussion, took in the situation with the practiced neutrality of a man who has worked for Matthew long enough to know that the man generally has his reasons, got his coffee, and excused himself back to the barn without comment. Matthew appreciated this about Cole. They drove out to the Leland property that morning in Matthew's wagon, taking the rough track northwest through the sage and grama grass. The September sky was enormous, and the light was sharp and clear the way it gets in Colorado in the fall, and Rose sat beside him on the wagon seat and watched the country with an attention that was less the attention of a tourist and more the attention of someone who is deciding whether they can live somewhere. She asked about Winters, and he told her straight. She asked about the nearest neighbors besides himself, and he told her about the Galvez family 4 miles west and an older German settler named Wilhelm Kessler 5 miles north who kept mostly to himself but was reliable in an emergency. The cabin, when they reached it, was better than Matthew had implied and worse than Rose had hoped, which was probably about right. It stood on its rise above the creek with a kind of stubborn endurance, A single-room structure of timber and chinking with a small lean-to kitchen added to the back, a stone chimney that leaned slightly south, and a roof that had surrendered in one corner to the weight of several seasons of snow and debris. The interior was dim and smelled of mice and dust, and the particular dry staleness of a space that has been closed for years, but the floor was sound except for two boards near the back, and the fireplace was intact, and the walls, when Matthew knocked on them, answered with the solid sound of timber that had not given in to rot. Rose stood in the center of the cabin and turned slowly, looking at everything. There was a quality of calculation in her expression, a woman measuring what was needed against what she had, and Matthew watched her do it and felt something that was close to admiration. "It can be made livable," she said, "by someone who knows what they are doing." "It can," Matthew agreed. "I can have Cole and Ernesto out here for 3 days and get the roof patched and the floor fixed and the chimney pointed up before the first hard frost. That gives you a place to be warm this winter." Rose looked at him. "Why would you do that?" It was a fair and direct question, and Matthew thought about it honestly before answering. "Because your Uncle Harold was a straight-dealing man and this was his home ground," he said. "And because you have come a long way and you have the right to find out if this land can be what you need it to be. And because I have the men and the materials and it is the decent thing to do." Rose was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I will not accept charity, Matthew. I will pay for the labor or provide something of equivalent value. I'm a fair bookkeeper. I have 2 years of legal and commercial correspondence experience, and I can cook if that turns out to be worth anything." Matthew found himself wanting to smile, which was not something he did with frequency or ease, and he restrained it with some effort. "The ranch books could use attention," he said. "We will call it an exchange." That was how it began. Cole and Ernesto and Matthew himself spent 4 days on the Leland cabin in the second week of September, while Rose stayed at the Hawkins ranch and worked through 3 years of account books with the systematic focus of a woman who had once managed her husband's commercial correspondence and found the chaos of Matthew's record-keeping both alarming and deeply solvable. She spread the books across the dining room table and organized them, and made a series of notes that, when she presented them to Matthew on the 4th evening over supper, demonstrated clearly that he had been underpaying himself by a reliable margin in his sales to Caldwell merchants, and that 2 of his ongoing supply contracts could be renegotiated to his significant advantage. Matthew looked at her notes for a long time. "Where did you learn to do this?" he asked. "My father was a commercial lawyer in Memphis," she said. "He believed that a woman who could not read a contract was merely a well-dressed liability. He taught me and my sister both before we were 15. "He was right," Matthew said. The cabin was done enough for habitation by the 3rd week of September, and Rose moved in with her trunks and her books and her particular brand of orderly determination. And Matthew told himself that the slight flatness the evenings took on once she was gone was simply the readjustment of a man who had become accustomed to company after a long stretch without it. He told himself this for approximately 4 days before he stopped pretending. He rode over to the Leland property on the 5th day on the pretext of checking the new roof flashing, and found Rose in the lean-to kitchen assembling what turned out to be a surprisingly accomplished pot of venison stew from a deer that Wilhelm Kessler had apparently appeared at her door that morning, and presented without explanation, which Matthew recognized as Kessler's particular form of welcome. She invited him to stay, which he did, and they talked through supper, and for an hour afterward sitting on the front step of the cabin, watching the stars come out over the ridge, and Matthew rode home in the dark feeling more fully awake than he had felt in years. He began finding reasons to ride over every 2 or 3 days. He told himself these reasons were genuine, which some of them were. The creek crossing on the track to her place needed grading. She had questions about winterizing the lean-to. He had brought a load of firewood from timber on his own place because her supply was insufficient for a Colorado winter. All of this was true, and all of it was also the elaborate scaffolding a careful man builds around the admission he is not yet ready to make. Rose, for her part, was not a woman who missed things. She had been through enough in the past 2 years to have stripped away any habit of comfortable self-deception, and she was clear-eyed about what was happening in the way that someone is clear-eyed when they have been afraid to hope for something long enough that they have become very good at noticing even small signs of it. She noticed that Matthew Hawkins listened to her. Not in the tolerant way she had encountered from men who were waiting politely for her to finish talking so they could explain what she actually meant, but with real attention, asking questions that indicated he had been following what she said carefully. She noticed that he treated Carmen Salinas and 2 horses, who occasionally visited the ranch, with the same straightforward respect he extended to Cole Briggs or any county official, which in 1884 in the Colorado Territory was not unremarkable. She noticed that his ranch, which she had by now seen in considerable detail through the bookkeeping work, was built with a thoroughness and care that went far beyond the functional. The detail in the orchard, in the bunkhouse construction, in the way the main house kitchen had been fitted out with every practical convenience, spoke of a man who had been building not for himself alone, but for some imagined life that had not yet arrived. She thought about this on an October evening when she was sitting at her cabin table, working through a letter to the county assessor about her property boundaries, and listening to the wind come down from the north for the first time with real winter in it. She thought about the empty upstairs rooms in Matthew's house. She thought about the way he had looked at her the first morning when she came downstairs, as if he were a man checking on something he had been waiting to verify. She was 31 years old, and she had loved one man and buried him, and survived the wreckage of what he left behind. And she was not a romantic fool who needed to wrap everything in sentiment. But she was also not a woman who was going to pretend that what was happening between herself and Matthew Hawkins was merely neighborly. The question was what to do about it, given that they were both apparently members of the same school of cautious people who did not say things until they were very sure. October moved along in the way of Colorado fall, brilliant and cold in turns, the cottonwoods going gold along the creek, and the first dustings of snow on the upper ridges. Matthew rode over one Wednesday morning to find Rose outside the cabin with a level and a saw, attempting to fix a porch step that had cracked. He watched her for a moment from the saddle, this woman in a practical wool dress with her hair pulled back and a handsaw in her hand, measuring the board with focused competence, and he felt the thing in his chest again, stronger now, less unnamed. He dismounted and said, "You are going to cut that to the wrong length with that measurement." Rose looked up. "I'm going to cut it to the measurement on the tape," she said, not defensively but with the patient clarity of a woman who has measured twice. "The step joist is not level," he said, crouching down to look at it. "If you cut to the tape you will have a gap on the right side. You need to add a 1/4 inch." Rose looked at the joist, then at the tape, then at Matthew. "You are right," she said, without any of the performance of conceding that some people felt was required. Just a straightforward acknowledgement that the information was accurate. It was, he thought, one of the most attractive things he had ever witnessed. He fixed the step while Rose made coffee, and they sat on the newly repaired porch in the thin October sun, and after a while Matthew said, "I want to ask you something." Rose said, "All right." He was quiet for a moment, a man choosing words with care. "What do you intend to do with this land?" he said. "The real plan, not the short answer." Rose looked out at the pasture and the creek and thought about it. "I want to run cattle," she said, "on a modest scale. I know that sounds absurd given where I am starting from." "It does not sound absurd," he said. "It sounds like the right answer for this land." "I will need to build up slowly," she said. "Buy a small starter herd this spring. Run them on the ridge pasture and the creek flat. Learn what I am doing while the operation is small enough that my mistakes are not fatal." She paused. "I will need someone to teach me the cattle work, which I know is asking a great deal on top of what you have already done." Matthew looked at the mountains for a moment. Then he looked at her. "Rose," he said, in a tone that shifted the conversation into different country. "I would like to say something to you, and I would like you to hear it the way it is intended and not the way it might be misread." She turned to look at him with those direct gray-green eyes and said, "Then say it plainly." "I have been building the Hawkins ranch for 15 years, he said, "and I built it with a thoroughness that went beyond what any single man needed, and I have never known entirely why until recently." He stopped and the wind moved in the cottonwoods and he pushed forward. "I built a house with rooms that stayed empty. I planted a garden too large for one person. I put in a kitchen equipped for a family. I have been telling myself for 15 years that I was simply a careful man who planned ahead." He paused. "I think I was waiting for the person it was for, without knowing who that was." Rose was very still. "I'm not asking anything of you," Matthew said. "You have come here with your own plan and your own claim and your own capable mind, and I respect that entirely and without reservation. I am not proposing to save you or to absorb your plans into mine. What I am saying is that I have been watching you these past weeks, and I think I understand what I was building toward, and I wanted you to know that. Whatever you do with that information is entirely your own matter." The wind came again from the north, carrying the first serious cold in it. Rose looked at Matthew Hawkins for a long moment, and then she looked out at her land, and then she looked back at him. "Matthew," she said, "I came to Colorado to build something of my own. That is still true, and it is not going to change." Her voice was steady, but there was something warm in it, something that had been very carefully maintained and was now moving. "But I have spent 2 years being entirely alone in the worst possible way, which is surrounded by people and still alone, and I have come here and in 6 weeks I have not felt that way once." She stopped. "I think that is worth saying out loud." Matthew sat with this for a moment. Then he said, "I think it is too." They looked at each other on the porch of the Leland cabin in the October sun, and both of them were too careful and too honest to rush it. But something had been said that could not be unsaid, and both of them knew it, and neither of them was sorry. November arrived with a cold snap that locked the ground hard for a week before the weather relented briefly into an Indian summer of startling warmth and clarity. Matthew came to the Leland property on the first warm day to begin the cattle conversation in practical terms, and brought with him Cole Briggs, who was the better horseman, and whose knowledge of range cattle was encyclopedic in the way of a man who had grown up in the Texas brush country and absorbed it before he could read. Cole was 41 years old, tall, spare, and so economical with words that a full sentence from him constituted a speech. He walked Rose Leland's pasture with the deliberate attention of a man reading a landscape in its own language, tested the grass with his boot heel, looked at the creek, examined the fence line, and finally said, 20 head to start. Build it slow. This ground will support 40 in a good year once you know it." Rose had a notebook out and was writing. Cole watched her write and said to Matthew in a voice that carried both approval and something close to wonder, "She is going to do it, is not she?" "Yes," Matthew said, "she is." It was during the Indian summer that the trouble with Gerald Purvis arrived, which neither of them had been expecting, though in retrospect the signs had been there. Purvis had done well enough with the Leland estate in St. Louis, but apparently he had also taken an interest in the Colorado land that Rose had not known about until a letter arrived from a St. Louis lawyer named Merton Gill, who wrote to inform Rose that Purvis was of the opinion that the Colorado property, having been held jointly in the Leland estate at the time of Thomas's death, was subject to the same claims he had pressed successfully against the St. Louis assets. Rose read this letter twice and then folded it with precise movements and set it on the table and was quiet for a moment in a way that Matthew recognized as contained fury rather than distress. "He is wrong," she said. "Tell me why," Matthew said. "Because the Colorado land came from my mother's estate to me directly," she said, "not from Thomas. It was never part of the joint assets. The deed is in my name only. It always was." She looked at Matthew. "He knows he is wrong. He is counting on the fact that it will cost money to prove it and that I do not have the money." "Is he right about that?" Matthew asked. Rose looked at him. I have enough for one season of operations, and that is it, she said plainly. A legal fight in St. Louis would consume that and more. Matthew said, how far will he push it? Gerald Purvis, she said, is the kind of man who pushed a widow out of her home 11 days after her husband's funeral. He will push it as far as is profitable. There was a silence. Then Matthew said, there is a lawyer in Caldwell named Henry Marsh. He is not a St. Louis lawyer, but he is careful and thorough, and he knows land law in this territory as well as anyone. I would like to have him look at your deed and your mother's estate papers before we decide what Purvis can and cannot do. Rose was quiet for a moment. Then she said, I will not have you spend money on my legal problems, Matthew. Your legal problems are also a threat to a neighboring property line, Matthew said evenly, since if Purvis somehow succeeded in claiming your land, the next question would be who he sold it to and what they intended to do with a boundary I share with your eastern fence. He paused. So I have a vested interest in seeing this resolved, and Henry Marsh owes me a conversation after a horse I sold him last spring turned out to be even better than I had represented. Rose looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, you are a very good liar about your motivations. I'm not lying, Matthew said. I'm just not listing them in order of importance. Henry Marsh came out to the Leland property the following week and spent the better part of a morning with Rose's deed and her mother's probate papers and 2 county maps. He was a stout and meticulous man in his 50s who wore a good suit even in the field and had the habit of reading documents with his lips moving very slightly, as though translating them from a language only he could fully hear. At the end of this process he straightened, folded his glasses, and said, Mrs. Leland, your land is secure. The deed is in your name and your name alone. The chain of title from your mother's estate is clean and has never touched the Leland marital assets, and Purvis has no legal basis for a claim. What he has is bluster and the hope that you will settle to avoid the bother. What do you recommend? Rose asked. A letter from me to his lawyer in St. Louis, Marsh said, citing the relevant statutes and the deed chain, making it clear that any legal action will be defended vigorously, and that we are prepared to pursue a harassment claim if he proceeds without basis. That should be the end of it. He looked at her over his folded glasses. Men like Purvis do not fight when the other party has competent counsel and correct documentation. They look for someone who does not. Rose thanked him with a composure that Matthew found quietly remarkable given what was at stake, and after Marsh had gone, she sat at her table for a moment with both hands flat on the surface and breathed. Then she looked up at Matthew and said, I want to say something to you. He waited. You have been very good to me, she said. And I have been careful not to take advantage of that, or I have tried to be, and I hope you know that. Her voice had a quality in it that was different from her usual directness, something quieter and more open. I came here not knowing anyone and with a plan that was quite possibly unworkable, and you helped me without making me feel like I needed to be grateful in a way that reduced me. That is not nothing, Matthew. That is in fact very rare. Matthew looked at her and said, You are not a woman who is easy to reduce. The small curve of her mouth came, the one that was not quite a smile. I have noticed that you try, she said. I do not try to reduce you, he said. I know, she said. I meant that you try to see me clearly, which is even rarer. Henry Marsh's letter went to St. Louis in November. Gerald Purvis's lawyer responded within 2 weeks with a brief and unenthusiastic withdrawal of interest in the Colorado property. It was, Rose reflected, anticlimactic in a deeply satisfying way. December came in hard and beautiful, the mountains going white above the high line and the creek freezing along its edges at night. Matthew rode over every few days to ensure the woodpile was adequate, and the lean-to kitchen had not developed any cold weather vulnerabilities, and Rose was always at the cabin, reading or writing or working on the meticulous planning that was consuming her evenings, the logistics of acquiring a starter herd in the spring, the budget broken into monthly columns, the lists of needed supplies and equipment. Her organization was thorough to a degree that made Matthew's own record-keeping look like what it was, which was the system of a practical man who had been doing everything himself and had no one to answer to. One December evening, he stayed later than intended because they were deep in a conversation about spring cattle prices, which had shifted to a conversation about whether the ridge pasture needed additional fencing before a herd could be safely kept there, which had somehow become a conversation about Memphis and St. Louis, and what Rose's life had looked like before Thomas died and before that. Back to a father who had taught her to read contracts and a mother who had kept Uncle Harold's Colorado letters in a box and read them aloud on winter evenings as though they were dispatches from another world. Matthew found himself talking about Tennessee, which he almost never did, and about his own father, who had been a decent man who worked a small tobacco farm and who had given Matthew the $40 and his blessing, and not much else when Matthew had announced at 22 that he was going west. He talked about the first years on the Colorado property, which had been brutal and lonely in a way that he had not let himself think about much since, because there was no use in it, but which he could describe now with a kind of settled distance, a man looking back at a younger version of himself with something between affection and compassion. "Were you never afraid you had made a mistake?" Rose asked, "Coming here starting from nothing. Every winter of the first 3 years," he said, "and then somewhere in the fourth winter it stopped feeling like a question I was asking and started feeling like the answer I was living." Rose looked at the fire. "I am still in the asking part," she said. "I know," he said. "You will not be for long." He stood to go, putting on his coat, and Rose stood too, and they were close in the small cabin, the fire warm behind them, the winter dark pressed against the windows. Matthew looked at her and Rose looked at him, and everything that had been building since September was present in the room and both of them could feel it. He said, "Rose." She said, "Yes," and he said, "I would very much like to court you if that is something you want. I'm not going to pretend I do not want it. I think we have both been pretending long enough." Rose looked at him for a moment with something in her face that was very honest, a woman not performing an answer but actually deciding it, and then she said, "I think that is exactly something I want, and I think you are right that we have been pretending." He did not kiss her that evening. He was too careful and she was too careful, and they were both the kind of people who move deliberately. But he held her hand for a moment when he said good night, his thumb across her knuckles, and that was enough and more than enough. And he rode home through the December dark feeling something he had not felt in decades, which was purely and simply happy. The courtship of Matthew Hawkins and Rose Leland was conducted with the particular combination of earnestness and practicality that characterized both of them, which meant it involved a great many suppers and conversations and rides across the winter-pale grassland together, and also a certain amount of actual work done side by side, because neither of them could entirely separate loving someone from building something with them, and both recognized that about the other. Cole Briggs said nothing about it for 3 weeks and then, in the economical way of a man selecting his single syllable carefully, said good. When Matthew mentioned Rose's name in a specific tone while they were checking fence line one January morning, that was the entirety of Cole's commentary. Ernesto, who was warmer by nature, said he was glad because Mr. Matthew had been alone too long, and it made the evenings very quiet, which Carmen had also said but with more words. 2 horses, when he heard, brought a small woven gift to the Leland cabin that Rose did not fully understand, but accepted with evident respect and gratitude. And 2 horses told Matthew afterward that Rose Leland had good sense, which from 2 horses was essentially a coronation. In February, on a Sunday when the sky had gone pale blue and the snow was old and crusty on the ground and the air had the quality of a winter that is considering, very slowly, the possibility of spring, Matthew came to the Leland cabin in the early afternoon and said, "I want to show you something." He drove her to the Hawkins ranch in the wagon and walked her through the house, which she had been in many times but always in the context of work or meals, never in the context of being shown. He took her through the front room with the wide fireplace and the good wood floor and the windows facing south, and the kitchen that had been fitted out with care, and the downstairs room where he slept, and then upstairs to the 2 rooms that had been empty for 11 years. He opened the first one, which had good light from the east window, and was large and warm and smelled of cedar from a chest that had been there unused. He opened the second, which looked south and was slightly smaller but caught the afternoon sun in a way that turned the air gold. He did not say anything immediately. He stood in the doorway of the second room and let her look. Rose stood in the middle of the room and turned slowly in the way she had turned in the Leland cabin on the first day, measuring, assessing. But this time when she turned and came back to looking at him, there was something in her face that was not the calculation of a woman evaluating infrastructure. There was something that was open and clear and certain. "Matthew," she said, "why are you showing me this?" "Because I want you to see what I have been building," he said, "all of it, and I want to ask you something." She waited, very still. "I know you came here to build something of your own," he said, "and I want that for you. I have never wanted anything other than that since the first morning I watched you look at the map of your land with that particular expression." He paused, and for the first time he looked slightly uncertain, not afraid but carefully honest in the way of a man who is saying something large and important and intends to say it right. "I am not asking you to give up what you are building. I am asking if you would be willing to build it alongside what I am building. The Leland property to the northwest and the Hawkins ranch here and whatever can be made of both of them together." Rose looked at him and said, "You are proposing to me." "I am," he said, completely and without reservation. Rose was quiet for what felt like a long time but was probably 15 seconds, and then she crossed the room and took his hand in both of hers, which were warm and steady, and looked up at him and said, "Yes, Matthew, yes." He had thought he would feel relieved, and he did. He had thought he would feel glad, and he did. What he had not anticipated was the quality of the feeling, which was not triumphant or even dramatically emotional but simply right, the way a door feels when the key is the correct one, a smooth and certain thing. He brought her face up with his free hand and kissed her for the first time, which was quiet and warm and real, and when they parted she was looking at him with those gray-green eyes, and she said, "I will not be a woman who disappears into her husband's property." "I know that," he said. "The Leland land stays in my name," she said. "Of course," he said, "and I intend to run my cattle operation as a separate concern that we collaborate on rather than merge," she said. "That is exactly right," he said. "We will draw up the partnership terms in writing." She looked at him for a moment and then said, "You are a very unusual man, Matthew Hawkins." "I have been told that," he said. They were married in April of 1885 in the Caldwell Methodist Church, which was a plain white building with 6 pews and a pastor named Reverend Cole, no relation to the ranch hand, who performed ceremonies with a brisk sincerity that matched the occasion. Carmen and Ernesto stood up with them, and Cole Briggs sat in the front pew in his only good shirt and his expression of stoic approval, and 2 horses came and sat quietly at the back and left before the reception, which Rose thought was his way of witnessing without making a production of it, and she respected it enormously. Henry Marsh was there, and the Galvez family from 4 miles west came with all 5 of their children, and Wilhelm Kessler appeared briefly during the reception and shook Matthew's hand without words and gave Rose a jar of honey from his bees, which was apparently his highest form of welcome, and then went back to his solitary 5 miles north. Rose wore her best dress, which was a deep green wool that she had bought in St. Louis the previous winter when she was still in the worst of the Purvis situation, and had bought it partly as an act of defiance, something beautiful and forward-facing when everything felt backward and diminishing. It turned out to have been, without her knowing it, a wedding dress for this specific day, which felt like exactly the kind of small grace that life occasionally provides when you have earned it. They drove back to the Hawkins ranch in the April afternoon, with the cottonwoods furred with new leaves and the creek running high and clear from the snowmelt. And Matthew lifted her down from the wagon, and she stood on the front porch of the house that was now her home and looked at the land running south and west to the horizon. And then she turned and looked at the house itself, and then at Matthew and said, "So these are the rooms we fill now?" "Yes," he said, "starting whenever you are ready." She laughed at that, which surprised both of them pleasantly, because Rose's laugh was not something she produced frequently, but when she did it was genuine and bright, and it changed her face in a way that Matthew decided in that moment he intended to spend the rest of his life earning. The first summer of their marriage was the summer that Rose Leland Hawkins found out what she was made of in terms of practical ranching, which turned out to be a great deal. She and Matthew bought 23 head of longhorn cattle in May from a seller in Pueblo and drove them north to the Leland pasture, which they had decided to call by that name still, to keep the land's identity clear, and because Matthew insisted on it, and Rose learned cattle work from Cole Briggs over the course of a summer that was alternatively exhilarating, exhausting, frustrating, and deeply satisfying. Cole was a patient teacher in the way of a man who has learned his patience from horses, which is to say he repeated things without judgment, demonstrated without condescension, and waited for the learning to happen at its own pace. Rose was a quick study with an analytical mind and good hands, and by July she was capable of most of the daily cattle management work, with assistance, and by September she could assess the condition of the herd with a practiced eye that made Cole say to Matthew, in the most expansive commentary he had ever offered on any subject, "She has got the feel for it." Matthew and Rose had developed by this time a life together that surprised them both with how natural it felt, as though they had been practicing separately for years, and the combination produced something neither had expected. Mornings were early and practical, the way ranch mornings are, with coffee at dawn and work before breakfast and a day structured by the land's demands. Evenings were theirs, and they spent them in ways that they had each been doing alone for years, reading, talking, reviewing the books, but that were different now in the way that anything is different when it is shared. They had arguments, as careful people do when they finally feel safe enough to have them. The first real argument was about fencing. Rose wanted to expand the Leland pasture fence line west toward the ridge. Matthew thought the cost outweighed the benefit in the first year. They argued about it for 3 evenings with the focused engagement of two people who take each other's opinions seriously enough to actually contest them. Rose turned out to be right. The ridge pasture, once fenced and grazed properly, produced twice the forage she had estimated, which Matthew acknowledged without reservation and Rose accepted without triumph, which was how they generally handled being right or wrong. Rose had come to the Hawkins ranch as a woman rebuilding a life from reduced circumstances, and she did not forget what that had felt like, which was perhaps why she was notably thoughtful about the people around her who were navigating their own difficulties. She noticed that 2 horses, who visited periodically, had a sister whose family was under increasing pressure from land restrictions that were being applied to Cheyenne families in the county, and she asked Matthew about it with the specific attention of someone who intends to do something. The injustice of what was happening to the Cheyenne families in the region was not something Matthew had the power to fix at a structural level, and both of them knew it. What he had done for years, and what Rose joined and expanded, was to offer practical support where it was possible: fair trade for labor, honest dealing, the use of water from the creek that ran through both properties without the artificial restrictions that other ranchers imposed. It was not enough, and both of them said so plainly to each other in private, but it was what could be done from where they stood, and they did it consistently. By October of that first married year, Rose was in the early stages of her first pregnancy, which she discovered with a mixture of joy and the particular brand of wide-eyed assessment of a woman doing rapid practical calculations, because she had not been entirely certain that motherhood was still going to be part of her story after the years of difficulty. she told Matthew on a Sunday evening in the kitchen, and he looked at her for a moment with a stillness that preceded something very large. And then he crossed the kitchen and held her in a way that was not complicated at all, just whole and certain. A man who had been building towards something and had found it. "We will need the upstairs room," Rose said into his shoulder. "Yes," he said. "The east one," she said. "Whichever one you want," he said. Their son was born in the last days of May 1886, on a warm evening with the windows open and the smell of the apple orchard coming through, which was beginning to bloom in that particularly sweet way it had in late spring. He was a healthy, loud, dark-haired boy who arrived into the world with the conviction of someone who has been looking forward to this and intends to make an impression. They named him Harold Thomas Hawkins, Harold for Rose's uncle who had given her the land, and Thomas for the husband who had been a good man despite his failure to tell her about the debt, which Rose had made her peace with in her own thorough way. Cole Briggs came to the door the following morning and stood in the hallway looking at the wrapped bundle Matthew was holding and said, after a long consideration, "He has got good color," which was as close to rapturous as Cole was capable of, and Matthew accepted it in the spirit it was offered. Carmen cried and was not ashamed of it. Ernesto shook Matthew's hand repeatedly. 2 horses brought a small gift without announcement and left it at the door, which had become his consistent and understood form of ceremony. Harold turned out to be a physically robust and intensely curious child who began pulling himself toward interesting objects earlier than anyone had expected, and who, by the time he could walk, had a particular fascination with horses that Cole observed with the satisfaction of a man watching the natural order of things unfold. Rose nursed him and kept him and read to him from her books beginning before he could understand a word, because her father had done this, and she believed in it. The ranch and the Leland operation continued to grow in the years that followed, knitting together through their shared labor and separate identity, in the way that Matthew had always instinctively felt was right. The Leland herd grew to 40 head by the end of 1886 and to 60 by 1888, and Rose managed the books for both operations and negotiated the cattle contracts with the Caldwell merchants with a directness and precision that resulted in significantly better prices than Matthew had historically received, which he acknowledged without embarrassment and applied gratitude toward. Matthew expanded the horse breeding side of the Hawkins ranch in 1887, adding 2 good breeding mares to the original stock, and Rose took the position that they should think of the horse operation and the cattle operation as both feeding into a single economic entity, even if the land was maintained separately, and drew up a partnership agreement accordingly, which Henry Marsh reviewed and found entirely sound. Little Harold was a year old when Rose told Matthew that they were expecting again, which she delivered over breakfast in the same practical tone she used for information about cattle prices, and Matthew looked up from his coffee and said, "Good," in a voice that managed to convey a great deal more than the word itself. Their second child, born in the spring of 1888, was a girl. She came into the world quieter than her brother and stayed that way in relative terms, a watchful and observant child with Rose's gray-green eyes and Matthew's tendency to assess a situation thoroughly before engaging with it. They named her Clara Frances, after Matthew's mother and Rose's closest friend in St. Louis, who had stood by her through the worst of the Purvis years, and who received the news by letter in Missouri with evident and tearful delight. Cole Briggs, in a departure from character that surprised everyone, picked up Clara the first time she was presented to him and held her with an unexpected competence, and then set her down carefully and said nothing at all for a full minute, which by this point Matthew and Rose both understood to mean that Cole had been profoundly moved. The years moved in the way of a life that is full. Harold grew into a boy of extraordinary energy and a natural affinity for horses that by age 5 had Cole shaking his head in the manner of a man who is watching a talent appear that he does not fully know what to do with. Clara grew into a child who was observant and quick, and who at 3 could identify 20 different plants on the ranch by name, because she had followed Rose around the garden and orchard asking questions with a persistence that reminded Matthew quite specifically of her mother. Matthew added a second bunkhouse in 1889 when the cattle operation expanded enough to require 2 additional hands, a quiet young man named Robert Plum from Kansas, and a capable and good-humored woman named Della Torres who had ranching experience from her family in New Mexico, and who came highly recommended by Carmen's cousin, and who turned out to be the best cattle handler on either property within a year. A fact that Rose noted in the books without comment and Matthew acknowledged with a pay increase. Rose completed a substantial expansion of the Leland cabin in 1890, converting it from a single room with a lean-to into a proper 4-room house, which they used as a second residence during the cattle-heavy seasons when the Leland pasture required daily attention. She hired 2 seasonal workers of her own for the summer and managed them without reference to Matthew, which was their agreement and which he honored in the way of a man who actually meant it when he said he would. There was a July evening in 1890 when Matthew came in from a long day on the range and found Rose at the dining room table in the house on the Hawkins ranch. The lamp lit, the books open, the children already asleep upstairs, and the orchard visible through the window in the last long summer light, and she looked up when he came in, and the look on her face when she looked at him was the look of a woman who is exactly where she chose to be. He washed up and sat down across from her, and she poured him coffee and said, "The third quarter numbers look very good. The Leland herd is going to finish the year stronger than I projected." He looked at the numbers she pushed toward him and nodded. "You were right about the ridge pasture rotation," he said. "The forage recovery rate is better than Cole's estimate." "I know," she said, and the small curve of her mouth came, the one he still worked to earn every single day. He reached across the table and put his hand over hers, and she turned hers over and held it. And outside the apple trees in the orchard that he had planted, in an excess of unexamined hope, in the second year of building something, he did not yet have a name for were heavy with August approaching fruit, and the creek ran in the dark, and the mountains stood at the horizon holding the last of the day's color, and everything was as it should be. In 1891, when Harold was 5 and Clara was 3, Cole Briggs did something that surprised the entire ranch, which was to fall in love. The woman was named Margaret Oakes, the widowed proprietor of the dry goods and feed store in Caldwell, who was 43 years old, and had short patience for nonsense and strong opinions about inventory management, and she and Cole had apparently been conducting a quiet correspondence for the better part of a year before Matthew and Rose became aware of it. The first sign was that Cole began making the supply run to Caldwell with unusual frequency. The second sign was that he bought a new shirt. The third sign was that Rose, who noticed things, told Matthew in late October that Cole Briggs was in love, and that Matthew should say something encouraging before Cole talked himself out of it. Matthew was not a man who typically inserted himself into matters of the heart, but this was Cole, who had been with him for over a decade, and who was as close to a brother as Matthew had, and so he found an occasion one morning at the corral and said, without preliminary, "Margaret Oakes seems like a woman worth talking to." Cole turned to look at him with an expression that combined surprise, embarrassment, and something that looked very much like relief and said, "Yes." "Then talk to her," Matthew said. Cole Briggs married Margaret Oakes in the spring of 1892 in the same Caldwell Methodist Church, where Matthew and Rose had married 7 years before. Rose was deeply pleased about this and organized the post-wedding dinner at the Hawkins ranch, with an efficiency that left Margaret Oakes remarking afterward that she had always been told Matthew Hawkins ran a good operation, but she had not understood until now that his wife was the reason it ran so well, which Rose received as an entirely accurate assessment. Margaret moved into the bunkhouse with Cole, which caused some logistical reorganization that Matthew handled by building a proper cottage adjacent to the bunkhouse that winter, which Cole said was unnecessary, and Matthew said was not, and was finished by March and was sound and warm and well-fitted. Because by this point, Matthew Hawkins did not know how to build anything that was not. The spring of 1893 brought the great cattle price depression that hit ranchers across the West hard and fast, the market prices dropping sharply in the wake of Eastern financial instability, and for 6 months the operation ran very thin. Rose, who had been watching the Eastern market signals for 2 seasons and had been quietly restructuring the cattle contract terms in a direction that insulated them somewhat from spot price volatility, navigated the worst of it with a tightness and skill that Matthew acknowledged with unreserved admiration. They came through it. They were not the only operation in the county to come through it, but they were among the few who came through it with the herd intact and no debt acquired. In the fall of 1893, Rose told Matthew she was expecting their 3rd child. She told him in the same kitchen, at the same table, in the same practical tone, though there was something in her eyes that was warm and certain, a woman who has done this before and knows how good it is. "We will need the second upstairs room," Matthew said. Rose laughed. "Yes," she said. Their 3rd child, born in the spring of 1894, was another boy, which Harold, aged 8, received as correct and excellent news. They named him James Cole Hawkins, the middle name chosen with Rose's characteristic directness, and delivered to Cole Briggs at the breakfast table one morning with the information that the boy bore his name, which caused Cole to put down his coffee cup and look at the table for a moment, and then look at Matthew, and then look at Rose, and then nod once, very slowly, in the manner of a man who has received something he did not know how to ask for and does not have the words for now that it has arrived. Margaret Oakes Briggs wiped her eyes and said, "That is a fine thing," which was the most effusive Cole had ever heard her be about anything, and he considered it accordingly. James was a child of extreme good humor and an appetite that seemed disproportionate to his size for the first several years of his life. He was round-faced and cheerful, and by 2 years old had determined that his primary goal in life was to follow Harold everywhere, which Harold tolerated with an older sibling patience that surprised Matthew and delighted Rose. Clara, surrounded by brothers, developed the particular resourcefulness of a middle child and the particular confidence of a girl who has been watched and valued and taught from the beginning, and she remained the one most likely to be found sitting with a book or following Rose through the records with intent questions. She had by age 8 demonstrated a grasp of the ranch accounts that Henry Marsh, who saw the books periodically, described as unusual for any person and remarkable for her age. "Your daughter," Marsh told Matthew in 1896, "is going to be formidable." "She already is," Matthew said. The decade turned in the way of decades with the particular compression of years that are full of good things. Harold became a horseman of the first order in his early teens, quiet with horses in the way of someone who has a true gift rather than a practiced skill, and he and Cole spent long hours together at the corral, in a transmission of knowledge from a taciturn master to an attentive student that Matthew watched with a pleasure that was both personal and general. It was good to see something valuable being passed forward. Clara read everything. Rose brought books from Caldwell and from a mail-order catalog in Denver that had expanded its educational offerings, and Clara consumed them with a focused appetite that reminded Matthew so specifically of Rose. The same complete attention, the same memory for what she had learned, the same habit of applying what she read to what she observed, that it produced in him a recurring and particular gratitude for the quality of what had arrived at his gate in September of 1884. James turned out to have an instinct for growing things that revealed itself when he was about 6, and began following Rose through the kitchen garden with the same intensity that Harold followed Cole to the corral. By 10 he was managing his own small plot adjacent to the main garden and producing results that Rose assessed with professional interest and quiet pride. In 1899, Cole Briggs retired from active ranch work due to a knee that had been complaining for 3 years and was now lodging formal objections. He did not retire from the ranch, which was not a possibility anyone considered. He moved his attention to the horses, which was lighter work for a man with a difficult knee, and Harold, who was 13, worked alongside him in a partnership that was less teacher and student now and more two horsemen of different generations who understood each other. Ernesto Salinas had gone back to New Mexico in 1895 with Carmen, whose mother was aging and needed help, and Matthew and Rose had given them a leaving gift that included a letter of reference that Matthew had written with more care than he gave most written documents, and Carmen had cried and Ernesto had shaken both their hands many times and said he had never worked for better people. Robert Plum had gone north to Montana in 1897. Della Torres remained, and by 1900 she was effectively the cattle foreman of the combined operation, a role she carried with calm competence and a dry humor that matched well with the working culture of the ranch. The new century arrived in Caldwell with the modest celebration appropriate to a town of its size, and Matthew and Rose drove in with the children on New Year's Eve and watched the fireworks that the town council had invested in with civic enthusiasm. And Harold held his mother's hand through the loudest parts because James had climbed onto Matthew's shoulders and was shouting with delight at every explosion. And Clara stood beside her father and said, in the considering tone she had inherited from both parents, "The ones that go green are the best." "I think so too," Matthew said. It was Rose who said, that night driving home under the black sky full of stars, with the children drowsing in the back of the wagon and Matthew beside her on the seat with the reins loose in his hands, "I want to say something." "Say it," Matthew said. "I arrived at your gate in September of 1884, she said, with a spent horse and a plan that was very possibly unworkable and no legitimate right to ask for anything from a stranger, and you opened the gate." "I did," he said. "And the thing I want to say," she said, "is that I know now what I thought was impossible to know then, which is what it was going to become." Her voice was quiet and even in the dark, no performance in it, just truth. "And it is the best thing I know." Matthew looked at the road ahead for a moment and at the stars and at the dark shape of the mountains, and then he looked at Rose. He said, "It is the best thing I know too. It has been from the morning you came down those stairs." She leaned against him on the wagon seat, her shoulder against his, and they drove home in the winter dark with the new century just beginning, and the children asleep behind them, and the ranch sitting ahead in the dark with its lights on, the lights he had always left burning. The house when they arrived was warm from the banked fire, and Matthew lifted James down from the wagon half asleep and carried him upstairs while Rose guided Clara and Harold in their wool coats up the steps in the half-dark. And there was a small, ordinary domestic traffic of tired people finding their beds that was nothing remarkable, and was also the most remarkable thing Matthew Hawkins could imagine, which was that all of this was here, and all of these people were his. And the house that had echoed with emptiness for 11 years was full in every room. He came downstairs after the children were settled to find Rose at the kitchen table with a cup of tea, still in her coat, reading a letter that had arrived on Friday and that she had not had occasion to fully read until now. She looked up when he came in and said, "My friend Frances from St. Louis is coming to visit in the spring. I wrote her to come and she finally agreed." "Good," Matthew said. "She is welcome." "She will be very surprised by all of this," Rose said, with the small curve of her mouth. "Probably," Matthew said. He poured himself a cup of tea and sat down across from her at the table that had once been very quiet, and she looked at him with those gray-green eyes in the lamplight. And they sat together in the warm kitchen of the house he had spent 15 years building for a person he had not yet known, and outside the apple orchard stood in its January bare bones, and the creek moved under its ice, and the cattle on the Leland pasture were sheltered and sound, and Cole and Margaret were warm in their cottage. and Harold's horses were in their proper stalls, and the books were balanced, and Gerald Purvis had not been heard from in 16 years, and Two Horses was alive and well and had stopped by. In November, with his sister's son, who was learning English and whom Matthew had talked with for 2 hours about horses, with Cole translating in fits and starts through 3 languages, and the mountains were there at the dark edge of everything, dependable and enormous. Rose folded her letter and set it aside and looked at him and said, "What are you thinking about?" Matthew considered the question honestly. "I am thinking," he said, "that I spent 15 years building a ranch and I did not know who I was building it for, and then you drove up that road and I understood." Rose looked at him for a long moment. "What did you understand?" she asked. "That it was always for this," he said. "All of it. The rooms and the orchard and the kitchen and every fence post. It was always for this specific life with this specific person." He stopped, which sounds like the kind of thing a man says when he is trying to be romantic. "It does," she agreed. "I mean it exactly," he said. Rose reached across the table and put her hand over his in the way she had done at that same table years ago, and he turned his hand and held hers, and she said, "I know you do. That is why it works." Outside, the Colorado winter held the ranch in its cold and patient dark. Inside, the fire breathed its slow heat into the rooms, and the lamp made its circle of gold on the table, and Matthew Hawkins and Rose Leland Hawkins sat with their hands together in the kitchen of the life they had made, and it was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything. Harold grew into a young man of 20 who rode like part of the horse, and who had, by 1906, taken over primary management of the horse breeding operation, with the kind of easy authority that is not performed but simply present. Cole, whose knee had finally made retirement in full a reasonable consideration, sat on the porch of the cottage in the mornings with his coffee and watched Harold work in the corral and said nothing, which meant he was satisfied. Clara, at 18, announced her intention to study at the Colorado State Normal School in Greeley, which provided teacher education, and which she had selected with the same thorough research she applied to everything. Matthew and Rose drove her to the stage in Caldwell in the fall of 1906 and stood watching the stage go, and were both proud and both quiet about it in their separate and matching ways, and on the drive back Rose said, "She is going to run something eventually, a school or something larger." "I know," Matthew said. "We raised someone formidable," Rose said. "We did," Matthew said. James, at 12, was still the most cheerful person on the ranch, and still following Rose through the garden with the focused devotion of someone who has found his thing, and intends to pursue it without apology. He had ambitious plans for an expanded kitchen garden, and a small orchard extension that he had drawn up in detail, and presented to his parents in the manner of a formal proposal, which Rose reviewed with professional attention, and Matthew approved without requiring revision, because the proposal was genuinely sound. In 1908, Matthew was 51 years old, which felt in his body the way years of ranch work tend to accumulate, the joints aware of history, the mornings requiring slightly more effort. Rose was 45 and showed it only in the silver threading into her dark auburn hair, which she wore differently now, less elaborate than the road-worn arrangement of 1884, simply and elegantly, because she had long since stopped caring about elaborate in favor of what suited her. They were on the south porch on a September evening, the same kind of clear fall evening that had been their season from the beginning, when Rose said, "Do you remember what you told me that first October about having built rooms that stayed empty?" "Yes," Matthew said. "I counted them," she said. "Yesterday, for no particular reason, every room in this house. 12 rooms now, counting the addition we built in '97. And," he said, "not a single empty one," she said. He looked at her profile against the evening light, this woman who had driven up his road in September of 1884 with her spent horse and her straightforward eyes and her plan that was very possibly unworkable, and who had turned out to be the truest thing he had ever seen, and he said, "No, not a single one." The orchard was heavy with September apples, the same orchard he had planted in the second year of building something he did not have a name for, and the light was going gold over the mountains, and the creek ran below the cottonwoods, and Rose leaned against him on the porch of the house that was full in every room, and Matthew Hawkins understood, clearly and completely, and without any remaining shadow of uncertainty, what every fence post and every empty room and every careful year of building had been pointed toward. It had been pointed toward this evening, and every evening before it, and every evening that was still to come. It had been pointed toward her.